Opening the diagonal for the queen and bishop, this immediately contests central territory and invites aggressive play. A sharp, asymmetrical pawn structure immediately emerges, setting the stage for a dynamic, counterattacking battle. Developing the knight centralizes it, eyeing squares and preparing castling for king's safety. Solidifying the center and preparing for the Sicilian defense's rich positional battles now takes precedence. Opening the center now forcefully challenges black's pawn structure and promises dynamic play ahead. Challenging the center's control, this capture immediately opens lines for a dynamic struggle. Opening the central files with the knight's advance invites dynamic exchanges and pressure on black's undeveloped kingside. Developing the knight here directly challenges white's central pawn and aims to quickly contest the initiative. Instantly asserting central control, this knight simultaneously prepares castling and pressures black's pawn structure. Preparing a queenside pawn lever for future expansion, this move secures potential squares while subtly questioning white's central control. Developing the bishop to g5 immediately applies pressure on the knight, hinting at a potential pawn structure disruption if black isn't careful with their responses. It also prepares for castling and asserts influence on the queenside. Stepping forward, black solidifies the d5 square and prepares to develop the dark-squared bishop, but it does create a potential pawn weakness on the kingside if the e6 pawn is ever pushed later without adequate support. Pushing the f-pawn ignites a bold central confrontation, aiming to seize more space and prepare for an aggressive kingside expansion, though it potentially weakens white's own king's shield. Introducing immediate counterplay, the queen now eyes the d4 knight, forcing white to consider its safety and potentially disrupting their nascent kingside attack before it even truly begins. Protecting the knight and preparing to castle kingside, white aims to solidify their central presence while also eyeing potential kingside attacks. The queen now stands ready to join the fray, potentially supporting an advance of the f-pawn or even a knight sortie on g5. Snatching the pawn at b2 might look tempting, but it instantly exposes your queen to a dangerous outpost and neglects development, leaving your king's side surprisingly vulnerable while white prepares a swift counterattack by solidifying their center. Asserting dominion over the open file, this maneuver aims to destabilize black's queen and exploit the awkwardness of its placement, potentially opening lines for further pressure along the queenside. This audacious queen excursion, while seemingly grabbing material, immediately exposes itself to a tempest of development and central pressure, setting the stage for a dynamic battle where black's king's safety might become a serious concern amidst white's rapidly assembling forces. Unleashing a pawn storm aims to break open the kingside, potentially creating a decisive attack against black's castled king by exploiting the open f-file. Developing the knight to c6 now aims to contest central control and prepare for potential pawn advances, while simultaneously offering a defender for the potentially exposed queenside if white continues aggressively with the f-pawn. Sacrificing the pawn opens up the f-file and targets the enemy king's safety, while simultaneously disrupting black's piece development. Reclaiming the pawn opens lines and allows your pieces to activate, potentially unleashing rapid counterplay against white's exposed king and the now less defended queen's bishop. Striking at the heart of black's pawn structure, this knight's sacrifice ignites a fierce battle for central control, exposing the weakened d6 pawn and threatening to pry open the kingside. Embracing the doubled pawns in the center opens up the b-file for your rook and potentially the c-file as well, creating opportunities for long-range pressure and a more dynamic endgame structure despite the pawn weaknesses. Unleashing a pawn storm here, white aims to shatter black's queenside pawn structure and exploit the newfound open lines, creating immediate tactical headaches and potentially exposing the enemy king to a dangerous frontal assault. The knight embarks on a daring centralizing mission, disrupting white's pawn chain and threatening a deep incursion into enemy territory, demanding immediate attention and altering the strategic landscape of the kingside. Initiating a decisive pawn storm, white sacrifices the knight to pry open the kingside and expose black's monarch to immense pressure, aiming to create mating threats along the open diagonals. Opening up the c-file for the rook now presents an immediate tactical challenge, potentially leading to a dynamic imbalance as the queenside structure is reshaped, while simultaneously creating an isolated pawn for black which could become a weakness later on. Preparing to consolidate the queenside and create a safe haven for the king, this piece repositions for defensive support and potential central pressure. A bold gambit to pry open lines, this recapture aims to destabilize white's central presence and potentially exploit the exposed king. Black gambles that the open d-file and increased activity for their pieces will outweigh the pawn deficit, seeking dynamic counterplay and initiative rather than positional solidity. This decision transforms the game into a sharp tactical brawl where precise calculation and piece coordination will be paramount. Securing the monarch becomes paramount now, as this castling maneuver tucks the king away from the central melee and prepares to connect the rooks for future action along the open files that are surely to come. Spotting the immediate threat and seizing initiative, this bishop sortie forces a concession from white's king, disrupting its safety and opening lines for further attack. The monarch's relocation to the first rank, while seemingly defensive, subtly prepares for an aggressive pawn thrust on the kingside, potentially aiming to exploit the now exposed dark squares around black's king. Opening the d-file with the rook heralds a significant shift, aiming to exploit the suddenly vulnerable center and white's slightly exposed king. Opening up the c-file presents an immediate challenge, forcing black to actively defend against potential pressure along that newly created avenue. Sacrificing the rook opens up the f-file, directly challenging white's recently castled king and potentially creating a dangerous mating attack. Recapturing the rook not only resolves the immediate threat, but also repositions white's heaviest piece to an active square, immediately eyeing the d-file and preparing for a potential central pawn advance, creating significant dynamic tension. A pivotal moment arrives as black seeks to develop the bishop, aiming to contest the powerful open c-file and potentially initiate counterplay against white's now exposed king, while simultaneously protecting the d5 pawn. The bishop steps onto the diagonal, aiming to disrupt black's nascent development and pressure the c5 square, potentially setting up a discovery if the queen moves. The seemingly simple pawn grab at c4 disrupts black's pawn structure, creating isolated pawns and potentially opening lines for white's pieces, although it also relinquishes the initiative for a moment. Liberating the bishop to attack the queen on e6 now creates immediate tactical threats and forces black into a reactive posture, while simultaneously solidifying white's central pawn control. Exploiting white's compromised kingside, black initiates a bold counterattack, targeting the vulnerable d3 square and aiming to disrupt white's queen's protection, potentially creating decisive tactical complications. Unlocking the c-file opens a direct assault line against black's vulnerable king, forcing an immediate defense of the pinned knight. The bishop now anchors itself on a central diagonal, eyeing the weakened kingside and threatening to unravel white's pawn structure further. Challenging the queen's central occupation and simultaneously aiming to break open lines for white's rooks. The rook's sudden appearance on the open b-file is a bold statement, aiming to exploit white's exposed king and create immediate threats along the newly liberated rank. Reclaiming the light-squared bishop from its passive guard duty, white aims to reposition it to a more active square, perhaps even targeting black's potentially weak king position on the kingside. Your specific move, 24, BD1. This retreat signals a tactical repositioning rather than a direct attack, allowing the bishop to potentially support pawn pushes or defend key squares. It's a subtle shift, preparing for future operations. Initiating a dynamic counterattack, the Black Monarch bravely ventures forward to secure a safer haven, seeking to escape the immediate pressure and untangle its defensive structure while simultaneously preparing to bring its remaining pieces into the fray. Unleashing a calculated sacrifice, White ignites a devastating attack on the exposed Black Monarch, aiming to shatter any defensive shell and expose the king's precarious sanctuary. The king makes a perilous dash into enemy territory, abandoning the safety of its castled position for the open plains, creating immediate tactical fireworks as White's rook eyes the exposed monarch.